Hello, we're really excited to see so many of you out here today for the unveiling of the new visual enhancements of PowerBuilder 2019 R3. These visual enhancements will help supercharge user productivity of your business applications with a richer UI and user experience. Now, typically when we get to a third revision of a major release, you're looking at minor enhancements and long-term support. But R3 is unique in that we went forward and actually made some significant changes to the product. And I'm just going to briefly recap that for you. We introduced a new feature called Power Client, which automates the deployment and updates of client-server applications. We've also done a number of IDE enhancements. The major change is decoupling the IDE in runtime, so now that a single PowerBuilder IDE can target multiple runtimes. And there's a number of use cases. If you're interested, we covered this in a separate webinar. I'd highly recommend you go check that out. We've also done significant enhancements to source control for Git and SVN, especially for Git. Now you can branch. And we've also enhanced the license mechanism to help you be more productive. You can use multiple versions of PowerBuilder that are installed on the same machine without consuming more than one license, so it's no longer necessary to log in and log out. The visual enhancements we'll be covering in today's webinar. There's also a new SQL Server driver available in R3, the MSAA DB SQL. And Microsoft has deprecated the native client, in case you're not aware, some years ago. So it's not getting any of the new SQL Server features. And Microsoft themselves are strongly recommending that you update from the native client to this. The nice thing is that you simply need to just change your connection string. It does not require significant code changes at all. And R3 is a long-term support version, which means you get a minimum of 5 years of bug fixes and technical support on this version. So it's a great version to standardize on. So now without further ado, let's talk about the visual enhancements. I think the highlight of R3 in terms of visual enhancements is the Chromium web browser control. Now, this is something we had in R2, and it's great to replace the outdated Internet Explorer Olay browser control because it supports HTML5 very well. It's much more secure than Internet Explorer. But what makes R3 great is that we've taken the Chromium web browser control and allowed it to do more than just simply display web content. You can now integrate your PowerScript and JavaScript together so that your PowerBuilder application and the web content are working in tandem. So let's take a look how we would do this. First, we've introduced asynchronous function and event. So there's a function called evaluate JavaScript async, and what you would do is you would pass in JavaScript code that you would like to execute asynchronously, or you could even be calling a function that exists in the JavaScript of the web browser control. Now, since this is asynchronous, we've also introduced an event that listens for when this asynchronous JavaScript execution is completed, and it will get the results set back from the execution of that JavaScript, and it will automatically format it in JSON format. So you could have multiple parameters coming back to you, and if there's any problems with the execution, there'll be an error also generated by the system to inform you of that. Now, there's also the option to execute JavaScript synchronously. So for that, all we provide is a function. There's no need for an event since it's being executed synchronously. And so you have the one function where you'd be passing in your JavaScript, getting the results set back in JSON format, and as well as if there's an error message, a string for that. Now, we also support user-defined events. So with the web browser control, you can create a user-defined event, and then inside the JavaScript of the web browser control, when that event takes place, then it would be triggered an event inside PowerScript. So the register event basically is to start listening for that event, and you would pass the event name. And the unregistered event is if you want to stop listening for that event. We also support both basic and digest authentications. So if the content in the web browser control requires such authentication, you'd see a pop-up window where then you could enter your credentials. Now, with this set of functions and events that we have, really you can do anything you want to do with this browser control. We're going to cover one use case, which is to create modern graphs and modern dashboards, basically, but really it's up to your imagination. Anything you put in that web browser control, now you can integrate it with your PowerBuilder application. So now let's talk about accessibility. PowerBuilder has had a Microsoft Active Accessibility as for many, many years, and this is a legacy technology from Windows 95. It imposes major limitations on complex controls of PowerBuilder. PowerBuilder does not have just simple controls like checkboxes and single line edits. The data window, for example, is a very complex control, many different presentation styles of it. Now, with the data window not being accessible, that means the most important part of your PowerBuilder application is not accessible to, for example, visually impaired or other use cases I'm going to highlight in a minute. Now, accessibility is required by certain regulations. For example, in the US, in the federal government, for example, there's something called Section 508 compliance, and your app has to be accessible. That's one of the requirements. But also another use case that we've been seeing in recent years among our customers is they're using RPA tools. For example, UiPath. So RPA is robotic process automation. And what these do is basically a software that will record some steps on the screen and then it'll play it. It'll control the screen itself automatically, and you can use that to automate certain processes like entering data automatically. So these are very powerful tools, but these tools rely on the accessible features of PowerBuilder to work properly. And so there's been a lot of issues with tools like UiPath being able to work deeply with PowerBuilder. Now, starting with R3, we've kept the MSAA for backwards compatibility in case your apps are relying on that, but we've introduced support for Microsoft's UI automation framework. And what's nice is if you've already set your app to be accessible by using the accessible name and description of fields for the various controls, then there's really nothing you need to do. Your app is already accessible through the Microsoft UI automation framework. So this UI automation framework is a successor of MSAA, and actually it's not brand spanking new. It's been around for quite some years now, but that's the latest replacement of the MSAA. And many automated testing tools or the robotic process automation tools I just talked about, like UiPath, they're actually designed to work with the Microsoft UI automation framework. And another benefit by Appeon supporting the Microsoft UI automation framework is screen readers can now properly read PowerBuilder applications, including within the data window and controls inside the data window. But you just need to keep in mind that you do need to avoid some of the unsupported controls. There's a few controls that are not supported through the accessible properties. One is a graph control. The other is the ink edit, ink picture, line, ole, oval, rectangle, ribbon bar, round rectangle, rich text edit, and the Chromium web browser control. Now, with data window, most of the presentation styles are supported. The only thing not supported is graph, ole 2.0, composite, and rich text. So this is a nutshell. If you really want to make your apps accessible, I recommend reading documentation. But at a high level, if you avoid these things, then your app should basically be there. Now, let's talk about some miscellaneous visual enhancements we've also done in R3 that is worth noting. If you're going to 64-bit, in the past, if you use a rich text control, it would actually be using Microsoft's rich text. And that's really weak compared to the TX text control that Appeon has OEM'd and put in PowerBuilder for 32-bit. So now we brought you the 64-bit version of this control. And we brought you the latest version, version 28, which includes a number of bug fixes and feature enhancements. So if you're trying to go to 64-bit, we're really starting to close that gap now in terms of the functionality. If you looked at 12.6, there was a huge gap on 64-bit. Appeon has been, with each release, been closing that gap. Now, with the PBU, when you're doing conversion from unit to pixels or pixel to units, in the past it was an integer data type, and now we support long in addition to integer. And this is really important for modern day computers. They're high resolution, 4K, 5K, and that's a ton of pixels, which exceeds the value of an integer. So you need a long data type for that. Also, if you've started using the ribbon control that we introduced in PowerBuilder 2019 R2, in R3 we have enhanced it so that you could put your images and other resource files inside of a PBR. So if you're interested to move forward with R3, no matter visual enhancements, ID enhancements, automating your app deployments, all the great stuff we've done, or you just want long-term support, we strongly recommend you try the beta today. It's available right now. If you're an existing PowerBuilder subscriber, just log into the Appeon website, appeon.com, click on downloads in the far right-hand corner of the screen, and you get it. If you're not an existing PowerBuilder subscriber, you're on 12.6 or older, then please email us at trial@appeon.com. We can arrange special access for you. Also, we really strongly encourage you to participate in Elevate 2020 to learn more about R3 as well as PowerBuilder 2019 R2 and all the other features out there. We have a ton of technical sessions from November 16 and 17. And what's nice is this is an online conference, so you don't have to travel anywhere. It's COVID-free. There's no charge to participate and learn and expand your knowledge. We got more than 30, 40 hours of technical sessions, not just presented by Appeon, but by real PowerBuilder users getting down into technical nitty-gritty and how they've been able to use the features of PowerBuilder effectively. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over now to Govinda, our Appeon tech guru, who's going to walk you through some of these great new features of R3.
Thank you, Armin. Hello everybody, I'm Govinda Lopez, and in today's webinar we will be talking about the visual enhancements of PowerBuilder 2019 R3. I'll begin with the enhancements to the web browser control, then the enhancements related to the UI accessibility support, followed by the enhancements to the rich text edit control, and finally some more miscellaneous enhancements. So let's start with the web browser control enhancements. The web browser control can be used to create a web browser that can communicate between a web page and the PowerBuilder client. But in fact, there are many use cases for this control. One of these use cases, for example, is to modernize the graph data window. So in this PowerBuilder 2019 R2 application, I have decided to use a data window to display a sales report. But this right here is a web browser control that is actually displaying a JavaScript graph. This is my sales graph. It's actually one of the free Google charts based on HTML5 and JavaScript. So as you can see here, if I place my mouse cursor over one of the bars, I will get a nice tooltip that displays the total road bike sales for the month. And if I click on it, I get this little rectangle. This will let me know that it is selected. So the web browser control is really good at displaying complex web content, but with the new enhancements added to this control in PowerBuilder 2019 R3, you can now interact between the PowerBuilder application and the web content. So let's open up a new PowerBuilder 2019 R3 application. This is a reporting demo application. Now on this department head count window, you'll notice that I have two graph data windows and two web browser controls. And the reason that we have these data windows here is that I will be using the data from the data windows to feed the web browser controls graph. But of course, this could in fact be data stores, and we wouldn't need to show any data windows here, but we've placed them here only for comparison. So let's take a look at the graph data windows first. I'll click on one of the departments. You'll notice that it is drilling down to the details of this department. Same thing if I click on a different department. But now if I click into the web content of the web browser control, for example into this department, you'll notice that I am also getting that nice tooltip. But I can now catch the values from within the web content and use them to display the next web browser's content. So this is also drilling down into the data in a master detail fashion. And see right here, this controls come from the web content. I can zoom into the bars. I can save this graph as an image. I can also view the data associated to this graph in a different format. Now, if I were to double click into the web content of the second web browser control, which is my detail graph, you'll notice that I can catch the data from within that dynamic web content and use it to retrieve the data window inside of this pop-up window. See, this is a free-form data window. And I passed in the employee ID from the JavaScript in order to retrieve the data window. Okay, it's time to take a look at how this is actually accomplished. I'll now open the PowerBuilder workspace of this app. In PowerBuilder 2019 R3, we have added 4 new functions to the control. Evaluate JavaScript sync, evaluate JavaScript async, register event, unregister event. We have added one brand new object event, evaluate JavaScript finished. And we've also added the capability to register a PowerBuilder user-defined event so that it can be triggered from within JavaScript. Okay, so let's start with the new functions that we have added. Right here is the first one. This is the evaluate JavaScript function. I can execute JavaScript code synchronously. So in my example here, we are executing this JavaScript event, which is the double-clicked event of the myShard JavaScript object. Now, if my JavaScript needs to be executed asynchronously, then I would use the evaluate JavaScript async function instead. One example of an asynchronous JavaScript function would be if my JavaScript shows dialog boxes. Then I would use that function instead. This would trigger the evaluate JavaScript finished event. So in my example, I'm using this event to catch any errors or to return the string values thrown by the JavaScript. But of course, you can use this event to continue any PowerScript processing once the asynchronous JavaScript function has finished. Okay, so that was PowerBuilder dynamically executing JavaScript within my web browser control. But what if I would like the JavaScript control to trigger a PowerBuilder event and therefore add more interactivity into my application? And let's say that I'd also like to catch any parameters returned from JavaScript. For that, we have the new register event and the unregister event functions. The first one is used to map my PowerBuilder's user-defined event, this UE double-clicked event, to the JavaScript event named double-click. So in this demo, whenever that JavaScript event gets triggered, it will also trigger my UE double-clicked PowerScript user-defined event for the second web browser control. The unregister event function is used to unregister the event. Okay, so we have talked about the web browser control enhancements and how to incorporate interactivity between PowerBuilder and the web content. Let's now talk about the UI accessibility support added to PowerBuilder 2019 R3. Previous releases of PowerBuilder supported a Windows accessibility and automation framework called Microsoft Active Accessibility, or MSAA. This is a legacy technology introduced in Windows 95. It supports the PowerBuilder standard controls well, but it imposes major limitations on the PowerBuilder custom controls, such as data windows. Starting from PowerBuilder 2019 R3, PowerBuilder now supports a newer and more capable technology which overcomes the limitations of MSAA. This new technology, called Microsoft UI Automation, offers a richer set of properties and extended interfaces to manipulate not only standard controls, but also custom controls such as PowerBuilder data windows and child controls in data windows. But you might be wondering, why is accessibility important? Well, accessibility, people that are visually impaired can use your application, and certain regulations require that your application can be used by visually impaired people, so you might need to use it to comply with said regulations. And that is because certain applications used by visually impaired people, like Windows Narrator for example, use the Microsoft UI Automation framework extensively. But even if your application is not required to cater visually impaired people, it will allow you to automate processes using robotic process automation, or RPA. One example of such tool is UiPath, and this RPA tool are quite common nowadays. The way they do automation is that they use the UI accessibility features. So now with this enhancement in which we support the new Microsoft UI Automation framework, you can now make use of these features too. So let's take a look at these differences. In order to do that, I'll start the PowerBuilder 2019 R3 IDE. Let's close this window and this workspace. I'll show you an application that has been set to make use of the new UI Automation framework. Let's open this data window for example. I'll click on any of the controls of the data window. Then I'll go to the other tab in the Properties pane. And as I mentioned before, PowerBuilder now supports both MSAA and the UI automation modes. So I have placed an accessible name and description to each one of my controls. This includes the column headers. See right here? One by one I can show it to you. Okay, so for example, the accessible name of this column is address, and then the accessible description would be the main address line. Okay, so let's now compare a PowerBuilder 2019 R2 application with a PowerBuilder 2019 R3 application. So this blue one is R2, and the dark one is R3. Now let's open the Microsoft Inspect Objects tools from the Windows SDK. Notice right here, it is set to MSAA. And if I click on the R2 window, it's not taking me to that specific object from my application, which is the data window column. So let's drill down all the way to the last object in the tree of this application. As you can see right here, I'm scrolling all the way down and drilling down to this. Okay, this one here. Let's move it over here. Click on it. Browse again, pane, and the last object right here. Notice that it hasn't detected the objects. So let's now change this to the UI automation mode. And let's take a look at the R3 application. So by just clicking on the application, I immediately get a list of all the objects in the tree. And see, these are my column headers. Address ID header, address header, address to header, CD, etc. And this here are my columns: address, CD, state, etc. So let's look at the columns. See right here, my accessible name is here. My accessible description is also here. Main address line. But wait, I can also obtain the value of the column's data. And I can even see the ancestors of the control as well. Whereas on R2, that's using the legacy MSAA framework, it has a very limited scope. Okay, so just to recap on the enhancements of the UI accessibility support. PowerBuilder 2019 R3 supports both MSAA and UI automation frameworks. Generally, you should use UI automation, not MSAA. And to take advantage of it all, you need to do is use the accessible name and accessible description of the PowerBuilder controls. So now, let's talk about the rich text control enhancements. PowerBuilder 2019 R2 uses the built-in TX text control for 32-bit applications. But if you compile a 64-bit application, then PowerBuilder uses Microsoft's rich text control. And there are big differences between these two controls. But with PowerBuilder 2019 R3, we have included the built-in TX text control in its 64-bit version. So this gives you virtually the same functionality as the 32-bit TX text control. But hey, let's take a look at them, shall we? So I can now close the Inspect Object tool and go back to my R2 application here. I'll click on Documents, and here we'll see the 64-bit rich text control from Microsoft. And here we can clearly see the first visual differences between each one. So for example, the toolbars are different. In R2's rich text control, the toolbar is outdated and old-fashioned. It doesn't include the zoom feature, the one that you get from the control in R3, like this. Now let's look at the rulers. So the one from R2 has limited functionality, and the tools included with it are limited. So let's compare them from the ones in R3. See, in R3 we have a formatting and indent tool, as well as the frame and page break section too. But if I click on these tabs here on R3, let's close this first. Here, I also get a nice pop-up window with some more properties for the tabs. Now I'll maximize the R2 window. See down here, we are missing the nice status bar from the built-in TX control. See here in R3, this status bar tells me the section of the document, the page I'm currently in, the line and column numbers, the language of the document, if my num key is on, and this fancy zoom tool. And here on R3, I can see both the header and the footer areas along with the content area as well. But those are some obvious visual differences. What about functionality differences, you may ask? Well, let's open the complex rich text file in R2 to start with. So for starters, my mouse wheel is not scrolling my document. I will need to do it with my keyboard's navigation arrows. And the document isn't displaying as I would expect it to. But now let's open this same document on R3. See? The new 64-bit rich text control supports complex rich text files. I can also scroll down using my mouse wheel too. But what about other file data types? So if I want to open or save a file in R2, I can only use RTF and TX formats. And you can also not save as PDF. So let's try to do that. See? Well, let's go take a look at R3 now, and let's open a file other than rich text and text. For example, this HTML file. Let's go look for an HTML file right here. I can also save as PDF. Here we go. Place a name to it. Report. Okay, so Here we have it. It's saved. And here's my PDF file. The new rich text control has a lot of new functionality, but Appeon has not yet had the time to expose all those new functionalities in PowerScript. But you don't need to wait. You can take advantage of the additional text control features today by using the OLE control. This control has a lot of functionalities. See here? This specific method, let's look for it. It's the load method. Here we go. This one has a way to load other file types. See? It also supports Microsoft Word formats. And this is not the only additional functionality. It can do lots more. So in this document here, I will show you how to insert this OLE control. You have to select the TX text control right here. Once you've inserted the control, let's see some advanced functionality of the OLE text control. See, I'm opening the Word document. And this is some more advanced functionality when using the OLE version. This has much more functionality in the editor. For example, I can do dictation, I can go to review and do tracking changes, editing documents, and here we have more controls on how to lay out the document. Okay, now that we have looked into the functionalities of the rich text edit control, let's take a look at how I can actually compile my application in 64 bits and include this new control. So I'll go back to the PowerBuilder. I'll open the application object, go to additional properties, click on this rich text edit control, and select the built-in text control. This one for 64 bits, which is the version number 28. Click apply and OK. Then save the changes. Then recompile my application. But don't forget that if you want to distribute your application that uses the rich text edit control, then you need to add the corresponding library. And don't forget that there is one for 32 bits and one for 64 bits. So you need to include the 64-bit library for your 64-bit application. But if you want to automate that, R3 has a new feature called Power Client, which will distribute the corresponding libraries for you. This will take care of deploying the necessary runtime libraries for your application. Here, this is the one. Okay, so we've looked into the enhancements of the rich text edit control for 64-bit applications. Let's now take a look at a couple new miscellaneous enhancements. So the first one is the fact that we now support listing the image files of the ribbon bar control in a PowerBuilder resource file. As you can see, this application uses a ribbon bar control. And I have now listed all the image files used by this ribbon bar control in this PBR file. Okay, so let's look at the size of my executable file. As you can see, it's only 174 kilobytes in size. So now let's add the PBR file to the project object like so. Here we go, selected. Okay, and now let's compile the application. See, it finished. But let's take a look at the size of the executable file again. See, it's now embedded the image files used by the ribbon bar control into the executable file, 476 kilobytes. And now I'll show you another miscellaneous enhancement. And this one is related to the pixels to units and the units to pixels functions of PowerScript. So on previous versions of PowerBuilder, these functions would return an integer value, which made it very difficult to properly interact with high-resolution screens. And the reason for that is that high-resolution screens nowadays support large amount of pixels that easily exceed the maximum values of an integer. So let me show you on this R2 application. If I wanted to convert, let's say, 33,000 pixels into units, this would actually truncate the result into a negative value. See? And it would be the same story for the units into pixels. See? Okay, but now on R3, we actually now support long data types for the return value. So if I convert 33,000 pixels into units, I get the correct value. And it works the same for the units to pixels too. We hope you try out and enjoy the new visual enhancements of PowerBuilder 2019 R3 and learn more on how to use them at the Elevate 2020 free online conference. Okay, Armin? I think it's now time for the Q&A.